Yeah, so there's 4 lectures coming up over this week and the next 3. And if you don't enjoy today's, then next week's is going to be much better. We've got Marion coming next week to speak to us about discipleship. She ministers in Forest Gate. Is that right? Is that down the Central Line somewhere? Yeah. And she's going to come and talk to us about discipleship. But tonight, we're going to do a bit of first century detective work and look at some of those basic sort of factoid questions about Mark's Gospel and where we might look to find out some information. And I've entitled those what, how, who, when, where and why. Admittedly, some of those questions didn't really work terribly much, so I've had to shoehorn in some information, but it's about right, I think. It's about right. So we start off with what? Oh, and I should say before we start that I'm very happy for people to stick hands up while I'm talking and to ask questions to clarify points. It's not just going to be an hour of me standing here and lecturing to you. Please do, if there's things on your mind or clarifications you want to make, do speak up. So what is Mark's Gospel, or more clearly, what on earth is a gospel at all? This is a copy on the right of the front cover of the Lindau Gospel book. It was a Swiss gospel book, and the Gospels have been greatly beloved of the church from its very earliest history, really. And on Sundays you see the red or white gospel book that we process with, and we give it a place of great exaltation because it gives to us the stories of Christ's life. I suppose if you were going to try and fit it into some genre, the one you'd most obviously go for would be biography. And if you wanted to fit it into an ancient genre, then the Greco-Roman biographies of the great heroes of that period of history would be the one you'd aim for. But it doesn't quite fit into those, really. Those histories, those biographies, are just a list of the deeds and the sayings of those great heroes. But the Gospels have something rather more than that. I mean, to start off with, we've got to remember that they begin as oral sources. So these are the remembrances of communities which are spoken from one person to the next, talked about round the campfire, and those stories, in the way that we all tell stories over and over again, begin to form regular patterns. And maybe we see that most obviously in the Passion narrative, which is just one big story chunk that would have been told from the start to the end. But we also see it in the individual chunks, things like individual parables or stories about healings, which kind of exist quite happily on their own. They have a beginning, kind of Jesus went to the town of whatever, and he did this, and then he said this, and then he departed. And they exist just on their own. And you can imagine people telling just that one story, and it's standing on its own right without the rest of the gospel material. And each one of those little stories, those little individual units, we call a pericope in the academy, or we call them stories everywhere else in the world. But that's what the word pericope means, which is a good one. The reason it's not exactly like a biography in the ancient world is because it doesn't just tell the acts, it also offers a purpose. So I've said that it's kerygmatic, and kerygma means the preaching of the early church. So the Gospels have a point, they have an intention. It's not just a historical list, a document of what happened. There's a purpose in it. They want you to go away thinking and feeling something different than you came to it in the first place. And they also try and place that person, not just Jesus, that is, not just in the historical context. So not just, this was a person who was born in this year and died in this year, and here are the things they did in between. But the Gospels offer a much more kind of global perspective of this person's life had an impact not just at the time, but from the beginning of history all the way through to the end. The Gospel is also unique in being the world's first cliffhanger. And that's me being a cliffhanger. You'll hear a bit more about this when Geoffrey talks about the Passion narrative, but those of you who listen to the bishops reading of the gospel might well have been surprised by the way the gospel ends. The women find the empty tomb and they tell no one, for they were afraid. And that's it. No resurrection stories. And in fact, the way the Greek word order works, it ends on the word for, which is a really strange place to end. And throughout the rest of the history of Greek literature, we find nothing else like this. No cliffhangers, no stories that end on that word. And so it's quite unique in that respect too. How do we come to know it? Well, initially, it would have been written down. Well, initially, as I said, it was passed orally from generation, from community to community, and it would have been spoken about when they met. The first time it's written down, it's written on papyrus scrolls, and these are the kind of things that we find in Qumran, in the desert communities. And sometimes they're rolled up on sticks, but more commonly, they're just rolled up by hand into tight things and stored in jars. And so you get some really interesting kind of watermark patterns, and you can tell how they've been stored and how they've been folded, because you get strange kind of pretty shapes. You know, like when you cut out snowflakes at Christmas from paper, you fold it up and you unravel them and you get, snowflakes or a string of men. You get the same kind of thing on these. And so you get a lot of damage in vertical lines on papyrus from the area where you've rolled it, and you get that kind of, you can see at the top and the bottom in the middle, that symmetrical shape damage. This is the earliest papyrus that we have of Mark's Gospel. It's 250 AD, and we call it Papyrus 45, or if we want a rather more exciting name, the Chester Beatty Papyrus. And it's a papyrus that contains more or less the totality of all four Gospels, not quite, and another couple of bits and pieces. It contains, I think, chapters sort of 4 to 9 of Mark's Gospel and 12 to the end, or something about like that. So this is how the written word would have, in the early church, been transcribed and passed from one community to another. The next thing that we see are codices. This is Codex Sinaiticus, which, if you were lucky enough to go to the British Museum 3 years ago maybe, they had on display. They don't have it on display very often. It dates from around the mid-4th century. It is absolutely priceless. It is, alongside Codex Vaticanus, our very best and earliest complete Bible, complete set of Gospel and New Testament letters. This is the way that after scrolls, moving on later into the tradition, things would have been written down. This has the danger that scrolls don't, that you lose pages. And so that strange ending of Mark, one of the possible explanations for it is that we just lost the back page at some point, and the thing that got passed down to us and copied out again and again is just missing the back leaf. And that's the danger of codices, that pages get loose and they fall out. Mark was originally written in Greek. All of the New Testament was originally written in Greek. Jesus would have spoken in maybe some Greek, certainly in Aramaic, and also in Hebrew. Very early on, sometime in the 2nd century, we start getting translations into Latin. The Latin translations are pretty dodgy, pretty terrible, really, and by the 4th century, the Pope is so upset by the fact that they're all saying different things that he gets Jerome to gather together all of the Latin texts and to conflate them and form a proper text using the best of the ancient Greek and also the Latin texts. And Jerome creates the thing that we think of as the Vulgate. And that happens in the 4th century. The first time that we see these in English is the Lindisfarne Gospels. We often think of, what's his name in the 16th century or 15th century translating Wycliffe. We often think of Wycliffe as the person who translated the Bible into English, but at least 400 years before him, the Lindisfarne Gospels in the mid-10th century were written. And they just translate you can see this is Marcus, this is the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. This is an actual picture of the Lindisfarne Gospel. and the major lines are written in Latin, and then you see the superscript. That is just a word-for-word gloss into Old English of the Latin script. So it doesn't make any sense at all, because it maintains the Latin word order, which doesn't necessarily correspond to the English word order, but it's just a direct translation into English. After that, we get the Wessex Gospels in 990 AD, something like that, and they're the first proper translation into a readable English, not for me, for any Old English experts out there, but the first proper translation into English that would make sense to an English reader in the 10th century. Of course, at that time, there are very few people who want to be reading the Gospels. Most people are receiving the Gospels through things like stained glass windows, through the illuminations on manuscripts, and still overwhelmingly by an oral tradition, by word of mouth. And actually, one of the real sad things that happens when we get to the Reformation and the English Bible is made available much more widely is that people get really upset that stories that they love, they can't find in the Bible. So there's this Gnostic story about how Jesus forms a little bird out of clay. It's in the Gospel of Thomas, and he sort of breathes onto it, and it's like the Genesis story of humankind being made out of mud, earth, dust. And he breathes onto this little bird, and then it sort of flies around, and he plays with some children with it. And this was like a real popular medieval story, and everyone loved this tale of Jesus. And they get their English Bibles, and those of them who can read look through, and they can't find this story, but you can certainly find it in stained glass windows in churches. So this is our early English Gospels, and then of course at the time of the Reformation we get an explosion of English Gospels. Who? Well, this is the first really complex question. St. Mark, of course, right? The Gospel according to St. Mark. That's an easy one. Well, it's not, because Mark is the most common name in the Roman world. So everyone and their brother are called Mark, which makes it very difficult for us to know which of the severally named people we're talking about, if any of them at all. Here are our top 3 candidates. We've got John Mark, Mark the cousin of Barnabas, and Mark the evangelist. So John Mark we learn about in the book of Acts. He is an assistant to Paul and to Barnabas on their missionary journeys. And then we kind of scrape together the fact that Paul's got a bit annoyed with him, because it sounds like, we only hear later that Barnabas suggests that they bring John Mark with them, and Paul says, no, actually, I don't want you to bring John Mark with you, because he left us in Pamphylia. Is that right? So they seem to have a bit of a bust-up. Paul has a bust-up with quite a few people, so it's not altogether surprising. So that's John Mark. And then there's, we're never really sure of the end of the story, but in one of Paul's epistles, he writes something like, and also bring John Mark with you because I have a use for him. Which sounds rather ominous, really, but if you want to take a favourable view on that, then you assume that means that he's giving him an opportunity to get back into his good books and to do some worthwhile ministry. So John Mark, that's one option. Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, he's mentioned in 3 of Paul's epistles. It's not clear whether Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, is the same person as John Mark. It's kind of possible, it's maybe quite probable, because of the closeness of the relationship between the two of them, that they pop up in fairly similar parts of the world quite regularly, but we're never offered any absolute that they're the same person. So maybe the author of St. Mark's Gospel is Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, and maybe that's the same person as John Mark anyway. And the third option is Mark the evangelist. And we're told by the early church fathers that the Gospel of Mark is written by Mark the evangelist. Evangelist comes from the Greek word euangelion, which means good news. EU, the prefix EU is the Greek prefix for good, and angelion is an angel, a messenger, one who brings news, so good news, which is an appropriate name for them to really give the person who wrote the good news. So Mark the Evangelist, that's who we're told by the church fathers, the sort of the bishops and the church historians over the first 300 or 400 years of the church's history. We're told that Mark the Evangelist wrote it. And this is our evidence for that. So Papias, the bishop of Hierapolis, he's writing sometime in the mid to early 2nd century. We don't actually have any of his works extant, but he is quoted by Eusebius of Caesarea, and Eusebius says, quotes a passage that Papias writes, and this is that passage. The elder used to say, and that's John the elder, Mark, in his capacity as Peter's interpreter, wrote down accurately as many things as he recalled from memory, though not in an ordered form, of the things either said or done by the Lord. For he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him, but later, as I said, Peter, who used to give his teachings in the form of anecdotes, but had no intention of providing an ordered arrangement of the acts of the Lord. Consequently, Mark did nothing wrong when he wrote down some individual items just as he related them from memory. For he made it his one concern not to omit anything he had heard or to falsify anything. And this has absolutely dominated for 1800 years our understanding of why the Gospel of Mark was written and who wrote it. It's worth noting as well that the Church Fathers, and right up to the start of the 19th century, there was no question at all that Mark's Gospel was just a shorter form of Matthew's. And really, they cared for Mark's Gospel very little, because why bother researching, reading Mark's Gospel when Matthew's Gospel has got basically the whole of Mark already in it, plus all of the other material? So Matthew's Gospel was seen as the one that was most important for evangelical work and was most important for study, and Mark's Gospel was demoted as being not terribly interesting and worthy of study. So for most of Christian history, 1800 years at least, Mark's Gospel hasn't had much of a look in. And this is the traditional view of how it was written, that Peter told Mark the Evangelist, and Mark wrote it down. This is my demonstration of our three people. They were thought to definitely be three separate people in the early church. We have a chap called Hippolytus of Rome, and we thought that we'd lost all of his works, and then in about 1850 we found three works at Mount Athos, where Bishop Jack always talks about. It's a monastic community in Greece. And this is where we find an awful lot of our ancient texts. The same thing with Codex Sinaiticus. We found it hiding away in a monastery somewhere. And Hippolytus writes his major work called The Refutation of All Heresies, and then he writes two other works, one called On the 12 Apostles of Christ, and the other called On the 70 Apostles of Christ. And they're the 70 that get sent out in Matthew's Gospel to go and do work. Go 2 by 2, don't take an extra cloak with you. If you go into a town and they accept you, stay there, and if they don't, you brush the dust off your feet and you move on to the next one. And in there he lists names of the whole 70, and he lists all three Marks as being individual characters who were part of those 70. By the time we get to the medieval times, they're pretty sure that actually they're not three separate things, they're one big thing, that all of those three characters are exactly the same person. Eusebius of Caesarea, who's writing in the 4th century, he says to us that it's Mark the Evangelist, and he even offers an explanation of how it all went down. He says that while Peter's on his way to Rome, he picks up Mark, he takes him as a travelling companion and interpreter, and Mark wrote down the sermons that Peter preached. And thus he composed the Gospel according to St. Mark. And then Eusebius reckons that Mark, after writing his Gospel, leaves to be the Bishop of Alexandria in the year 43, which is a slight problem because the Gospel is definitely not written by the year 43. And it's also more of a problem, well, I mean, that's enough of a problem. It's also a problem because those of you who listen to the Gospel of Mark being read, and those of you who've read it, will know it doesn't really read like a series of sermons at all. I don't know anyone who preaches by just exclusively telling stories in the way that Mark's Gospel tells them without terribly much analysis or teaching. We hear from the Coptic tradition that Mark the evangelist dies in the year 62. Again, that's a problem because the Gospel probably still isn't written by 62. And so today, the answer is that we just don't know, really. It seems very unlikely that any of those three candidates, whether they are three separate people or whether they all represent the same one person, it seems unlikely that any of those wrote the Gospel of St. Mark. We think the author is anonymous to us. It's possible, I suppose, that we discover some other ancient manuscript that gives us new light on it, but the question is fairly firmly settled that with our current manuscripts and knowledge, there's no way for us to know. And similarly, we are in agreement with the ancients that whoever wrote it was not an eyewitness to the accounts. So yes, they did learn it from somewhere else, whether they learnt it from the oral traditions of their community or whether they had one person, maybe Peter. Again, that's probably a bit of a romanticization to believe that, but it's not impossible. But however they learnt it, they weren't eyewitnesses. It's not at all unusual as well, and it's not... we would think of it as being, I don't know, unscholarly, or maybe even sort of improper to attribute a book to someone who didn't write it. But that wasn't at all unusual in the ancient world, and neither was what we would think of as stealing material. Matthew and Luke, without any excuse at all, just wholeheartedly rip enormous tracts straight out of Mark's Gospel, and that's not seen as an embarrassing or improper thing to do at all, without giving any citations. That's just the way that literature works. So it's not unusual for it to be the Gospel writings to be told as if they were written by someone else. Any questions at this point?
So, not the young man who ran away from Garden of Gethsemane losing his dignity at the same time.
So you'll see this image here shows the Garden of Gethsemane.
Stooge time.
And the chap in the red robe is Christ, and the chap kissing him in the blue, you will see is Judas. There's the Roman soldiers there, and in the bottom right we have this young man who's about to be made nude as his blue robe is ripped off him. And as Ian rightly pointed out, there's this very strange verse in Mark's Gospel. It's exclusive to Mark's Gospel, one of the very few stories. We've got this chap disappearing. That's one of the stories that's exclusive. There are 2 or 3 more. Anyone want to make any guesses? Ian?
No.
The healing of blind Bartimaeus and the other blind healing story, they form a start and an end of chapters 8 to 10. And the first time he heals him, and he asks him what he sees, and he says, I see trees as if they're perambulating, kind of walking trees, and then he has to heal him a second time. Do you remember that? And it's quite an embarrassing story, really, that he doesn't get it right first time, and he has to have a second go at it. And then by the end of that period of those 8 to 10, chapters 8 to 10, he heals another man of blindness, and he heals him right first time. And it's about the progression of faith that occurs in the people being healed over those chapters. So the first time, the person being healed is without faith, and so they don't believe and they're not healed the first time round. And by the end of those chapters, the person is now with faith and they're healed first time round. So those 2 stories are unique, and there might be one more, but I can't remember what it is. And this story is unique. And it's a really weird detail to keep, that this young man ran off naked. And it quite interested the ancients. It doesn't just interest us today. St. Jerome, he reckoned that it was James, the Lord's brother. Eusebius of Caesarea, he says that James wore a linen garment all of his life, and that's how we can identify that he's the one who ran away, because that was, the linen garment was his trademark, if you like, that was ripped from him. St. John Chrysostom, St. Ambrose, St. Gregory, they all think that the naked man was St. John the Apostle, because St. John is the youngest one, and he's a bit of a kind of fiery upstart, and we're told that it's a young man, and he would have been the sort of person who would have, run away naked, apparently. Don't quote me on that one. I don't want to be sued by St. John. In the medieval times and up to today, it's become a much more exciting idea that maybe this is St. Mark, and this is Mark's opportunity to write his own name into the gospel. This is his calling card, if you like, his trademark. Look, I was there. This is me. I suppose the same way that sort of the thing that strikes me immediately is the same way that kind of serial killers leave cards at murder scenes. But there's probably a better analogy. Maybe the way that on our windows. That's a better analogy, isn't it? These windows were made by someone terribly famous, and he leaves a little ear of corn in each one of them. So Geoffrey tells me. So a bit like that. It might well be that the person who wrote it has added this detail in to put themselves in the story, but the overwhelming evidence is that they were not an eyewitness. So were they really there? Maybe not. Would
Mark written that of himself?
Yeah, I suppose it's a bit of an embarrassing episode to put into the public sphere, isn't it? Yeah, well, that's why people keep coming back to it, because it just sticks out and it doesn't have an easy answer. Why on earth is it in there at all? There's a thing called the criterion of embarrassment that scholars use, and that says the more embarrassing a passage is, the more likely it is to be authentic. So if you've got a passage where kind of Jesus tries to do something and gets it wrong, you'd have no reason to want to invent that. Because if you're going to invent any material, you're going to invent material that serves your own purpose. So if there's material that goes against the purpose of your writing, or in some other way makes the church look weak or embarrassing, then it's going to be historical, because the only reason you're going to include it is because you think, well, I can't leave this out because I know it actually happened. So on that basis, we might think it was historical. It's
picture depict when Jesus was arrested.
Yeah, that's right. This is when he's arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane.
And is that right? Judas kissed him.
Yeah, so Judas betrays him with a kiss. He goes to the Roman and Jewish authorities and he says, "The man that I kiss will be the one." And he goes and. I'm not sure whether do we read that he actually went and kissed him. I think we do. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's. I mean, that's an accurate-ish representation of what we read in the Bible.
So do you think he was seeking forgiveness?
Who?
Betraying him, Judas.
No, he's pointing out.
No, he uses that as the signal for the guards. He says to the guards, "You'll
see.
know which
Right.
one you're meant to arrest, because he'll be the one I go and kiss."
Oh, right.
So it would have been a usual greeting to someone to whom you were subservient, to your master or
Yeah.
teacher. You would have gone and kissed them.
Right.
Yes.
John, can you repeat the comments and questions? Because we can't
Yeah.
hear
Sorry. Yeah. I will. Yeah. So, Marion, what was your?
I asked the question, would Mark have written
Yeah.
that of himself? Because it says here, when they seized him, meaning when they seized Jesus, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. This is a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment. That's here in the Gospel. But would Mark have written that about himself?
Yeah, it is an unusual calling. You can think of a more generous way to write about yourself, couldn't you? You could write a story in which kind of Jesus on his travels bumped into you and said to you, I prophesy to you that your future is full of great things. That's the kind of thing you might expect someone to write if they were inventing their own calling card. That this one day I bumped into Jesus and he said I was a great chap. That kind of thing. So yeah, it does continually crop up as a sore thumb, an odd one out, But I don't think there's any universal accepted explanation for its purpose.
If you are writing it in collaboration with Peter, then Peter has a very similar and extremely embarrassing incident himself just a while later. And you just wonder whether, there's something of that in it. I did the same as Peter did, sort of thing.
Yeah.
We don't.
Yeah, because of course Peter denies Christ 3 times. So yeah. There's certainly a reflection of a similar theme there. That takes us to when. As I showed you earlier, that Papyrus 45, that's our earliest copy of the Gospel, and that is the year 250. But certainly the Gospel has to be written a lot earlier than that, because we have, by the mid 2nd century, we have Eusebius taught. Not Eusebius. We have. I've lost who it is, but we have one of the church fathers telling us that the 4 Gospels are more or less set as the Gospels that the church regularly uses in its worship. So we can date it at the very latest in the mid 2nd century, but we want to go earlier than that. And the way that we do that, the first question that we have to answer and take a stance on is who was first. And this is an exceptionally complex question. The name for this whole area of study is the synoptic problem. So there's the 3 synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and then the 4th Gospel, John. And John's Gospel is quite unlike the other 3. It shares a lot less material, it's much less historical, it's much more theological, and 95% of scholars think that, maybe more than that, would all agree that St. John's Gospel was the last one to be written. It shows that the church has built up a kind of Christology, they've been studying who this person Jesus is, and they're offering a much more complex theology about him. A very, very few scholars, and I'm not even sure whether anyone can hold to this anymore, like John being a very early gospel, but that's certainly not a mainstream view at all. So the question then becomes, between Mark, Luke, and Matthew, who knew whose gospel, and when were they chronologically written? And we know that there's certainly some crossover between them, because what this picture's meant to represent is that 76% of Mark's gospel you can find in Luke and in Matthew as well. So it's so common that it can't just be a shared oral tradition. The word structure, the order is so similar one to the other that unless, which is an outside possibility, unless you had storytellers who were so competent and conditioned into providing the story in exactly the same way, you wouldn't get these the level of crossover that you get. So it seems almost certain that Matthew and Luke and Mark at some point saw one another's texts. And the questions that we then have to answer is, well, who saw whose? Who was borrowing from whom? The most common understanding is that Mark has priority. As I say, throughout history, up to the start of the 19th century, the church always assumed that Matthew had priority, and that Luke used Matthew's, and then that Mark had access to both Luke and Matthew's gospel, and he decided that, they were too long for one sitting or something, and he kind of préceded them, shortened them, borrowed material from both. It's possible, but it's extremely unlikely for the following reasons. It seems to make a lot more sense that Matthew and Luke would have expanded on Mark's gospel than that Mark would have taken a gospel that was already there, shortened it, and added very little of his own material. His unique material makes up 3% of his gospel. It's unclear what purpose it would have served to have taken a more substantial gospel and chopped bits out of it. There's also the style. Mark's Greek is quite slapdash. It's not grammatically terribly good. And Matthew and Luke, when they do borrow passages from Mark, if indeed that's what they do, they clear up some of those grammatical errors and mistakes, and they make it read much more clearly and much more eloquently. It seems incredibly unlikely that Mark would have taken the nice Greek of Matthew or Luke and made it less pleasant. Then there are things that we call hard readings. So, for example, Mark has the following story concerning Jesus. In Mark chapter 6 we read, "He was not able to do a miracle there, except to lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he was amazed because of their unbelief." He was not able to do a miracle there. So it's as if he kind of tried, but he couldn't do it. In Matthew we read, "He did not do many miracles there because of their unbelief." Either Matthew has softened the words that Mark's written, or Mark's made Matthew's words more difficult to believe. It seems more likely that Matthew is going to have made it easier for the reader to accept this than that Mark is going to have made it kind of more embarrassing and more difficult to accept. Then there's an idea called editorial fatigue, and that is that Matthew, when he's borrowing from Mark, and Luke, when he's borrowing from Mark, sometimes they'll change words because Mark uses them poorly, but then later on, instead of changing the word again, they'll forget and they'll lapse back into just copying Mark. So when Matthew first introduces us to Herod Antipas, he uses the correct title, which is Tetrarch. Mark uses the word king. And then later on, when he's borrowing another passage from Mark, Matthew uses the word king. It seems very unlikely that Mark would have borrowed from Matthew, or it seems very unlikely that Matthew would have used one word and then used another when one is correct and the other is a bit mistaken. It seems much more likely that he's borrowing from Mark, and the first time he corrects it, and the second time he misses out on correcting it, and he just writes down exactly what Mark wrote. So, as long as you accept Markan priority, which 80% of scholars probably do, the issue with scholarship is that you don't make your name by writing exactly the same as what everyone else has written. So if you're a budding PhD student and one day you want to be a professor at Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge, you write something absolutely outlandish and you hope against hope that someone else says, "Oh yeah, that might actually be right." So you always get this kind of diverse range of opinions, but the mainline accepted idea is that Mark was the original gospel, Matthew and Luke borrowed from him, and then you see that bit of the bottom that says double tradition. There is a sayings source that we call Q, because of the German word quell, or kell. Nominate Kevin, which means source in German. And they both have access to it, and Mark doesn't. And they borrow from that source lots of the sayings. So what Mark's gospel really lacks in is moral teaching. I'm not sure if you when you were listening to it, if you noticed, it's kind of this story happens, and that story happens, and that story happens, and half of Mark's gospels begin with the word and more or less the other half begin with the word immediately. It's very kind of childlike, and Jesus did this, and then he did that, and then he healed this person, and then he went there, and then he went there, and then he... There's very little of that kind of moral teaching and a new way of living your life that we're much more used to hearing in things like the Sermon on the Mount. So the Beatitudes, they're not in Mark. The Lord's Prayer, that's not in Mark. And that's another good reason to think that Mark didn't have Matthew. Would he really have cut out the Lord's Prayer? It seems improbable. So concerning the actual dating of Mark's Gospel, as long as we accept Markan priority, the fairly standard answer is 70 AD-ish. A very important event happened in 70 AD. You can see it there on the right by David Roberts. It is the siege and destruction of Jerusalem, and most importantly, the temple, which is the heart of the Jewish people. It's right at the center of their religion. It's where they do their practice. And it is for them a symbol of the entire Jewish nation, and it gets destroyed, and its ripples are felt across the Jewish diaspora, and it's a time of great mourning. And indeed, it's never rebuilt, and if you go and see the Wailing Wall today, what you're seeing is the west wall of the temple that was destroyed in 70 AD. Mark 13:2. Any Bible scholars out there want to hazard a guess at that?
You see these great stones?
You see these great stones, indeed. This whole chapter, chapter 13 of Mark's Gospel, is called the mini-apocalypse, or the little apocalypse. It's that whole chapter that's about what's going to happen at the end times, and about there'll be wars and earthquakes and rumours of wars, and families will divide and fight against one another, all of that kind of that business. And it begins by Jesus being with his disciples outside the temple in Jerusalem and saying to them, have you got it, Ros?
He says, "Do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down."
Brilliant. Yeah, so he's just left the temple and he says all of these things are going to be thrown down. So the question that we then have to ask ourselves is, if this was written before 70 AD, then we have to accept that as a kind of prophetic, either a prophetic message from Jesus, or the war, the tumult, the build-up, the tension began sometime between 62 and 65 and then continued to increase. So the writer of Mark's Gospel might be thinking, well, it's looking pretty likely. But if we have it written before 70 AD, before the destruction of the temple, then we either have to think of that as strictly prophetic, a guess about, or a divine message about what's going to happen in the future, or guesswork by the writer. If we have it written after 70 AD, then what the author of Mark's Gospel is doing is putting into Jesus' mouth words that came true. Except that they didn't quite come true, because we know the west wall is still standing. No stone will be left standing on another stone, and a whole wall is left up. And so again, we encounter our old friend, the criterion of embarrassment. That is to say, this is rather embarrassing because Jesus predicts something that doesn't actually come true. Well, maybe the reason that that's still in our Gospels today is because it definitely was a thing that Jesus said, and the writer thought, well, even though this hasn't happened, I can't possibly leave it out. So it's either just before 70 or it's just after, but it's sometime round then. And as long as we accept Mark in priority, we know that it can't be much later than 72, 73, because there needs to be time for Mark's Gospel to be distributed to the authors of Matthew and Luke's Gospels, and they need to get their hands on the material so they can borrow it, write their own, and we know roughly when we want them to be able to be writing their Gospels, and so we work back from there.
Did you not say Mark had already died?
Yes, so Mark the Evangelist, one person claims that he goes off to be Bishop of Alexandria in the year 42. The Coptic Church, their history tells us that he died in 62. All of that is evidence for why Mark the Evangelist probably didn't write the Gospel of Mark, because he would have been dead by the time it was published. We're more sure about the date of publishing than we are about the authorship. Whereabouts did the Gospel get written? Well, for this, there is one overwhelming answer, which is Rome. And there's a good number of reasons for believing this. Mark's Gospel contains lots of Latinisms, that is, words from that are borrowed, loan words from Latin to Greek. And so we read things like Latin measurements, when he's talking about distances. He talks about Roman soldiers using the Latin words rather than the Greek words. He talks about Roman coins rather than Latin coins. He talks about the Roman word for a centurion, where both Matthew and Luke use the Greek word instead. So it sounds like he's talking to a people who would be more familiar with Latin than they would be with Greek. Now that's not absolute evidence, because Latin would have been spoken widely across the Roman Empire. It's not at all impossible that all of these creep in because they're words that the Gospel author regularly hears in his day-to-day dealings. Added to those Latinisms is the fact that the Gospel deals an awful lot with persecution, and from that we contend that the people that he's writing to are also suffering under persecution, and that that theme in the Gospel is meant to build up and encourage them that persecution is part of the Christian lifestyle, that Christ and his disciples underwent persecution, came through it, and that the people hearing this will also come through it. We know that the Christians in Rome were having a really tough time of it, but the Christians in Palestine were not having an easy time either. So that offers some evidence towards Rome, but equally evidence towards Palestine and some other areas of oppression. If we think that Peter is involved in the writing of the Gospel or in passing on the message that we hear, we know that Peter spent the last days of his life in Rome, so that fits in nicely. Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria, early church fathers, they both state that the Gospel of Mark was written in Rome, and we have no early church fathers offering us an alternative reason. The author of Mark clearly has no first-hand experience of the geography of Palestine.
Yeah.
We read in chapter 11 actually, that Jesus, it says, he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee. Tyre is, which way is going to work for you? Hang on.
Put the sea on the left.
The sea on the left, yeah? So sea, oh, your left, here. Okay, so the sea's here, and this is Israel here, and it kind of comes down at a bit of an angle like that. And Tyre is just there, on the coast, and Sidon is 20 miles north on the coast just here, and the Sea of Galilee is about 30 miles south-southeast of Tyre. So to go from Tyre to the Sea of Galilee via Sidon is not a very sensible trip to make. That's one instance, and that's the most obvious one where the geography is out of whack. There's another couple where that are maybe more believable circuitous routes, but nonetheless appear to be fairly unlikely. All of that evidence suggests to us a non-Palestinian and a pro-Roman setting for the writing of the Gospel. Most people are fairly happy with that. Every now and then some scholar says, oh, well, maybe it was Alexandria. Maybe the best alternative, I think, is Chad Myers. He wrote a book called Binding the Strong Man in 1988, and it completely revolutionized Markan studies, really. He thinks it's a small, oppressed Palestinian sect, and he sees Mark as explicitly a political gospel. If you swallow a bit of what he says, you kind of got to swallow the whole lot and forget more or less everything of what I've said tonight. I can't give you the whole lot of his book. It's a really brilliant book, and for some scholars, it completely rewrote the basic level of how we think about Mark's gospel. It wasn't enough to convince everyone, and it was a product of kind of Reagan-era politics, and it was written in Berkeley in California under a kind of very liberal regime, and it's all about sort of privilege to the poor and radical political engagement. I find that very attractive. Plenty of scholars on the more conservative end, found it nonsense. I commend it to you as a very readable book. It's a bit out of date now. It has lots of kind of up-to-date, at the time, references about Reagan-era politics and that sort of thing. So it's a little bit, it tastes a little bit out of date, but nevertheless, it's a really good radical alternative. And he thinks a small Palestinian community is the setting. That's, I think, the best alternative, but everybody else believes Rome. Which brings us to our final question: why was the gospel written? And this splits people in two halves. The options on the table are either evangelism or for Mark's worshipping community. The gospel begins, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Straight away it tells you what it's about, and that word gospel again is the same word that I talked about earlier, euangelion, the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So the hearers know from the very beginning that a claim is being made about Jesus, that he is the Son of God. Mark doesn't kind of build it up and then suddenly surprise us with it at the end. He surprises the people within the text. Everyone in the text, they don't realise until right at the end. But we, the readers, know from the very beginning. This is the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so that suggests that it's meant to be an evangelical tool, for evangelism. Its purpose is evangelism, of bringing the gospel to fresh ears and having people believe this Christological claim, this claim about who this human person is, that he is also God. We also read lots of miracle stories, lots of healings, and even quite a few that almost appear like kind of magic tricks, like that blind Bartimaeus, the double healing, the spitting, kind of spitting on the thing and then saying magic words, Ephatha, that word that no one can ever pronounce, kind of E-P-H-T-H, I think it starts, Ephatha, which means be open. That's almost like kind of a magic act, abracadabra, and then... So those things might be appealing to people who've never heard the story before, and they want a piece of some kind of supernatural power. So there's all these miracle stories, all these healing stories, and perhaps people who are unconvinced will think, oh, well, if he's that powerful, if he could do that, and those kind of magic sounding stories would be very familiar to the ears of Romans, because those are the same ways in which kind of charlatan magicians carried out their trade, or not even necessarily charlatans. I mean, we think of them as kind of charlatans and quacks today, but the healers and the magicians of the time, that's the way they would have carried out their trade. So it would have been quite familiar to their ears. It would have been a way in for them to understand the kind of person that Mark was claiming Jesus was. On the other hand, we have things like teaching on divorce. How is that useful for a new Christian, for someone coming to the faith for the first time? We have the Last Supper, the account of the Last Supper. Again, probably not terribly useful for someone coming to the faith for the first time. Those are much more the sort of resources that we would use in church. That teaching on divorce, that's the kind of moralistic thing that you might preach on, the kind of rules that you might set for your community, the standards which, as a committed Christian, you would be required to adhere to. The Last Supper, again, that's an act which you would carry out within your community. It tells you the story that you're to repeat. Do this in remembrance of me. And for that reason, perhaps we think actually what Mark is a pastor. He's a leader of a community. He's writing in 70 AD, so he's maybe worried that those people who did know Christ in the flesh, or even the first generation who were told by the apostles the stories, they're beginning to die out, and something needs to be written down and saved for the sake of those who are coming after. a guidance book, a book of that oral tradition needs to be created for when the people who know those stories off by heart die out, the next generation will be able to access them. There's also many teachings about hardship and persecution. And those are not the sort of things that you write down if you're trying to intrigue and bring people into the fold. You don't tell them, if you're a Christian, it's going to be really tough for you and it's going to be horrible and most of you are going to have to die as martyrs, and everybody will hate you, and if you become a Christian, you're committing yourself to a future where there's earthquakes and storms and violence and families are going to get broken up and fight one another. These are not words to intrigue people and capture them and bring them in. But they are good words for a community that's already suffering persecution, and you want to tell them there will be an end to this. These are hardships that were prophesied that you need to go through, and at the end we see the light of the empty tomb of the resurrection. So the case is kind of split on that one, whether it's an evangelistic tool or whether it's for a pastoral purpose. Could it be both? It probably could. It's more usual for a single manuscript like this to be written for a single purpose, for there to be an overriding intention of the author. But I'm not sure that I want to put my money on one or the other, really. That's my who, what, where, when, and how. Any questions? Marion.
In this version, which is the New International Version, it does have verse 8 of chapter 16 finishing with, "They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." And then in very small print it says, "The most reliable early manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have Mark chapter 16 verses 9 to 26. So where did they come from? Which does in fact tell us about the...
It does, yeah. So it's resurrection. So there's kind of three possible endings. There's either that ending, "for they were afraid," and then there's the earliest manuscripts have this ending, which is an ending with resurrection stories, and then there's another shorter ending, which was even later, which has got kind of the most absurd non-Markan language. It's all about the fulfillment of the righteousness of the kingdom of something or other. So where they came from is we have a process of the writing of the gospel, and quite possibly some redaction after that. So Mark is handed some material, or he knows some material from the oral tradition, and he himself uses that and shapes it and decides what he puts in and decides what he leaves out to fulfill his purpose in writing his gospel, whatever it might be. And that's why it's important for us to get a grip on why he wrote it, because that will tell us a certain amount about why he included one story and he didn't include another. Then there were the people who were copying Mark's gospel. And as I said, the first copy we've got is 250. So we've got another nearly 200 years of time between that copy and when it was written. And the Gospels that we read today, the material we read today, is not a direct translation of any one source. It's a translation and a conflation of early Greek sources, like that Papyrus 45, and we've got a whole host of other papyri, some tiny little scraps with no more than a verse on, some with chapters on, and often they disagree with one another in one way or another. Sometimes it's very simple. It's, what conjunction did they use? Sometimes it's completely the opposite thing. So sometimes it's about whether Jesus was happy about something or whether he was angry about something. And we also use the Latin text because, strangely enough, because all of these Latin translations were made, sometimes the Latin translations that we have access to are earlier than the Greek texts that we have. So the Greek texts are copies of copies of copies. The Latin texts are translations of copies, but they might be translations of better copies of the Greek. And often it's just done word for word, the translation, so we can just translate it back word for word fairly accurately. And there was a standard set already of translating Hebrew into Latin from the Old Testament and some bits of Greek into Latin. And so we're familiar with the kind of word choices that they would have made for their translations. So we have this period of redaction where Mark changes the material that he gets given, and then the scribes and the copyists, sometimes they redact the material as well. And often what they do, which is really unhelpful, is if they've read other Gospels, if they've read Matthew's Gospel, they see that there's a difference between Mark and Matthew's Gospel, and they harmonise. So they think, oh, one of them must not have got it right. I'll pick this one, I like this one. And so in the later manuscripts, we find bits of Matthew's Gospel finding their way back into Mark texts because some overly helpful scribe has thought, I'll add that back in, yeah. And then we have church. We think now of the biblical kind of canon as being absolutely set and untouchable. The canon was only set in the 7th century in the East, and actually at the Council of Trent in the 16th century was when it was finalised in the West. Now, by the mid-4th century, by 300 and something, everybody was using the same exact set of books and nothing was added or taken away from then. And by the mid-2nd century, 150-ish, maybe even earlier, everybody is using the same 4 Gospels and nothing changes from then. So it's not officially set until later, but earlier on it's unofficially set. But nevertheless, these alterations are taking place and communities continue to add their own experiences in. And so some early community that's using Mark's Gospel thinks, hang on a minute, this is a bit fishy without any story of the resurrection at the end. It's leaving us a bit too unsure. We don't know anything about this cliffhanger. This is the first time we've ever come across something like this. It would be much nicer if we stuck an ending on this. It would feel much more like what we're used to. So they just stick an ending on that they basically rip from the end of Matthew's Gospel, and it makes them much more comfortable.
It's quite common, Jonathan, for people who are hostile to Christianity these days, from Stephen Fry onwards, and Richard Dawkins and so forth, to emphasise this point that the Gospels were only written, or only the earliest copies of the Gospel we got are from the sort of 4th century AD. And I think what you've done tonight is to help us to see much more clearly that the history of the creation of the Gospels and the existence of the Gospels goes back a lot further. I read a wonderful book by J.A.T. Robinson, who some of the older ones, you remember J.A.T. Robinson, the one who was honest to God, wrote a fabulous book called Redating the New Testament.
Okay.
And he takes the fall of Jerusalem as being the date before which almost everything has to be written, because none of them celebrate the fact that Jesus got this right. But I think it's really important that we know this stuff, that our Gospels do go back to the eyewitnesses. They do go back to the time, roundabout, very much to the time of Jesus, and not simply polemics written many centuries after Jesus was crucified. So my thanks to you tonight for bringing that out so clearly.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So the Gospels are written 1st or 2nd generation, and what's worth remembering is that Paul's letters are early. Well, Paul's early letters, things like the letter to the Romans and to the Corinthians, are certainly earlier than even the earliest Gospel. They're going around 10, 15, 20 years after Jesus' death, so very quickly those items are circulating. And compared to things like Caesar's Gallic War or Josephus's History of the Jewish People, the Gospels are far and away the best attested ancient books that we have. Far and away. Things like Plato's Republic, you're waiting 1,000 years before you get your first copy. There's a 1,000-year gap between the earliest copy we have of Plato's Republic and the writing of the book. The Gospels are incredibly well preserved for an historic text. Janet?
You mentioned the Gospel of St. Thomas. Can you say something about the Gospels that didn't get into the Bible?
Yeah. There's a good deal of we call them normally we call them Gnostic Gospels. The Gnostics were a group who were around during the time of Christ and shortly thereafter, and they believed that the world was created not just by God but also by this thing called the Demiurge, and the Demiurge was a kind of shadow god. And the Demiurge created everything that's matter and material. They're very much Greek philosophers. They think in dualities. So the Demiurge creates things that are material and evil, and God creates things that are spiritual, spirit and good. And so they're very much anti anything bodily, and they're very in favour of all things spiritual and mind. And Christians speak out against them in saying that it's very important that Christ was incarnate. That is, that he really took our flesh. He was really a person. He wasn't just the Spirit of God living inside a shell. And actually, that's one of the great travesties that we sing at Christmas. Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see. Hail the incarnate deity. That's nonsense. Don't believe a word of that. There's nothing. It's not about being veiled in flesh. It's about being properly, really united, God and humanity, in flesh, in reality, a real man walking about. And so they wrote, or those communities authored other Gospels, one of them being the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is probably the most reasonable to fit in with our Gospels. Often they have some fairly kind of wacky and way out stories about Jesus making kind of magical flights. I mean, miraculous things beyond the pale. And often they have things which we would now see as being out and out unorthodox. But at the time, of course, there was no such thing as orthodoxy. A great debate rages about why one was picked and another not. Mostly they're later, so mostly they're 2nd century and beyond. But the Gospel of Thomas is maybe written around the same time as the Gospel of St. John. You could kind of argue, and people have, that St. John's Gospel does belong to that thing of Gnostic Gospels, because it is so dissociated from structured reality and much more spiritualized. Jesus has all those passages where he talks about himself being the bread of life, and there's all of that talk about light and darkness, and that's very much falls into that duality model that the Gnostics were so fond of.
But is this St. Thomas, the same Thomas?
This is not St. Thomas, the so-called Apostle of India. No, this is again attributed to St. Thomas, maybe written by his community and attributed in his name, maybe written by anybody else and attributed in his name to give it credence and weight. But no, Thomas be well dead by the point it's published sometime between 120 and 150 AD. So the question of why they're not in our scriptures is that mostly they're later. Mostly they have some stories that appear too crazy, although our current Gospels have some pretty crazy stuff and stuff that's difficult to find cohesion with the rest of the stories. And mostly they don't fit the orthodox view that was developing in the early church. But they're certainly worth reading and exploring, and you can get good copies of them now and good translations. For a long time it's difficult to get good translations because people didn't care about it so much. Now you can get excellent translations, and they're also all available online. There's a website called Past Masters, which gives you kind of available freely from about kind of important literature from about 1700 AD all the way back to 1000 BC, and you can get them on there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope you... I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, come again next week. It will be Marion speaking next week, who will be talking to us about discipleship, and not just in the sort of dry academic way I did tonight, but also in Mark's call on discipleship on our own lives today. So it will be a bit more of an involved or organic talk than mine was. So look forward to that. Come and support her as our visitor. That would be great. Have safe journeys home tonight. God bless you.
Thank you very much.